$20 million for the establishment of a national network of adult, child and youth mental health treatment centres. This network of centres, operating under the no wrong door approach, will be an important element of the nation's mental health and suicide prevention plan. Mr Speaker, I'm fighting to deliver a head-to-health centre for Barker to help in the health and wellbeing of my regional community.
In accordance with Standing Order 43, the time for member statements has concluded. The Prime Minister, I think, with ministerial arrangements.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I present a revised ministry list reflecting changes to the ministry. Thank you, Mr Speaker. Statement. Mr Speaker, I also inform the House that the Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment will be absent from question time today and for the remainder of the week, and the Treasurer will answer questions on his behalf in the Trade, Tourism and Investment portfolio, and I will answer questions on his behalf in the Foreign Affairs portfolio.
Questions without notice. The member for Shortland.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Resources. Can the Minister confirm he traded away his opposition to net zero for the resources sector for a cabinet promotion with extra salary? Why is it about your job, not regional jobs?
The Minister for Resources has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. What we always know about the opposition, Mr Speaker, they are all about digging up dirt, but not in the way the resources sector does it, Mr Speaker. It's all about politics with those opposite. The hard-working men and women of the sector, Mr Speaker, are out there turning over dirt, shipping coal, shipping iron ore, delivering critical minerals, driving jobs and driving our economy. Now, Mr Speaker, those opposite, I'm sure, will continue this line of questioning, but I can say unequivocally, every day that I get up, that I'm in a role in the government, I'm looking to deliver for regional Australia, I'm looking to deliver for our country, I'm looking to deliver for the individuals that we represent who are out there working hard, paying their taxes, taxes which are much lower under this government than they would be under the opposition, Mr Speaker, I have to say, but we will continue to deliver for them, because it is about them.
The member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Prime Minister. The return of New South Wales students back to school today is yet another significant milestone in our fight against COVID-19 and further proof that the national plan is working. Will the Prime Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is putting the right plans in place to ensure Australia can recover from the pandemic and have a stronger and more secure future?
The Prime Minister has the
Thank
call.
you, Mr Speaker. I'm sure the member for Robertson, like many parents in this place today, are very happy that kids are going back to school in New South Wales today, Mr Speaker, and that's very welcome. I even noticed that Paul Gallen, the former Cronulla Sharks player, has posted today with his kids, and he's being very happy that the kids are going back to schools. I'm sure all parents are, Mr Speaker. All parents are very happy that their kids are going back to school, because this demonstrates, Mr Speaker, that the national plan is working. The national plan is reopening Australia and giving Australians the opportunities to reclaim their lives and claim back so many of the things that have been taken from them through the course of this COVID pandemic because of COVID-19, Mr Speaker. And I want to thank all of those parents who have been enduring the challenge of homeschooling over such a long period of time. I want to thank all of those who are so patiently working through with their kids to ensure that they weren't going to miss out on their own education. And I think that has been a tremendous contribution by those parents, and I want to thank the teachers as well for their very detailed attention to the needs of their students and making sure they were doing everything within their power to ensure that their students, Mr Speaker, were getting the best possible education under what has been very, very difficult circumstances. For those aged 12 to 15, the vaccination rate, Mr Speaker, is 63.8% on first dose, and on second dose 34.5%. But as the member for Robertson will be pleased to know, in New South Wales the double-dose vaccination rate for 12 to 15-year-olds is greater than 50%, Mr Speaker. Nationally, 86.8% first-dose vaccination across Australia, some 73.4% of second-dose vaccinations, Mr Speaker, which means there is more than 15 million Australians right now who are double-dose vaccinated all around the country. And, Mr Speaker, at some 73.4% double-dose vaccination only a month ago, that was 50%. Just 50%. So, Mr Speaker, the response of the Australian people to the national plan has been truly extraordinary. And what that has meant is Australia will emerge from this pandemic with one of the lowest fatality rates of any country in the world. We will emerge with one of the strongest economies to come through the pandemic anywhere in the world, Mr Speaker, and we will emerge with one of the highest vaccination rates of any country in the world, Mr Speaker. That is a national plan to take Australia through the COVID-19 pandemic crisis and to take us forward. And so as we go forward, the borders are opening, 11,000 Qantas staff back at work, Mr Speaker, getting planes in the air, opening up our country, bringing Australians home, bringing their parents home, Mr Speaker, from next week and indeed earlier because of the changes we're making, the borders opening up and ensuring that Australians can be reunited. So we go forward with a stronger economy and a stronger health situation, Mr Speaker.
Has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for Resources and Water. Last week, the Minister told Question Time, quote, "Find me a solar panel that works in the dark." Is the Minister aware that batteries can store renewable energy? And does the Minister get a shock when he turns on the tap and water comes out even though it's not raining outside?
The Minister has the call.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thought they brought the big guns, but they brought the top gun, Mr Speaker. Unfortunately, the Leader of the Opposition has backed up the exact thing that I've said. Solar panels don't work in the dark. That is just a statement of fact. If you want to store energy, there's any number of ways of doing that, Mr Speaker, as there has been for a long period of time. And it's the resources sector that's delivering the equipment, it's delivering the technology, it's delivering the resources to make those things a reality. So, Mr Speaker, I say to those opposite, you can use a dragline to dig up your political dirt if you want. It'll have no impact on me. I'll stay focused on what I do every single day, which is deliver for the people I represent.
The member for Flynn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Will the Deputy Prime Minister outline to the House how the Morrison-Joyce government's plans to deliver infrastructure projects and creating jobs in the regional and remote areas of Australia, and in particular ensuring critical infrastructure in Northern Territory? Thank you.
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question and always note the work he did in bringing about Rookwood Weir and also with the member for Capricornia. But it doesn't just stop there, Mr Speaker. The Epping floodway to get the Bruce Highway going north, that was about a $100 million deal. I remember the work the member for Flynn was doing on that. Or if you go out to Gracemere, you go out in a new road from Rockhampton, and Gracemere is an incredible sale yards, incredible part of the commerce of central Queensland. And yet again, the member for Flynn and also the member for Capricornia, who's not with us today, they were absolutely instrumental in that. But it's more to the point of what we are doing away from the site of this building. Away from the site of this building, in fact, 1,600 kilometres northwest of Brisbane is the town of Boulia. 300 people, Mr Speaker. And between Boulia and Laverton, in fact from Winton to Laverton, the coalition government has been investing in the Outback Way. You can go from Winton, Mr Speaker, to Boulia on a sealed road. You can go from Boulia 140 kilometres west on a sealed road. In fact, there's only a further 70 kilometres to the Northern Territory border. And we've been working very closely, and we always know the champion of this road is the former councillor, the former mayor of Alice Springs, Damien Ryan. Damien Ryan, he is a champion of Lingiari. He is a champion of the Outback Way. He is making sure that we drive this agenda forward. Mr Speaker, they say that the traffic at Boulia will increase by 225%. That's a CSIRO. We know of transport companies that will make Boulia their base, bringing jobs out west, and there'll be jobs all the way through. Mr Speaker, it goes beyond that. It goes beyond the work of former councillor Ryan. It also goes to Jacinta Price. What an incredible person she is. What an incredible champion for the Northern Territory she is. I was speaking to Jacinta Price just before I came in here, and we were saying, what are the things that are important there? She went through aged care. Obviously, she talked about the investment the coalition are doing in defence, how important that is, that infrastructure. She also mentioned some bad roads which over the last 50 years, in excess of 20 kilometres, where nothing has happened. She talked about the road from Alice Springs to St Teresa, and she said how work needed to be done on that. She talked about the road from Alice Springs to Kintore and the work that needed to be done on that. And she knows there's only one side of government that she can be a part of that will ever look after the people of Outback, will ever look after the people of Lingiari.
The member for McMahon. The member for Lingiari will withdraw that remark. And he can now withdraw from the chamber. The member for McMahon has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Resources. Does the Minister agree with the New South Wales Treasurer who said yesterday we have some of the best renewable resources anywhere on the planet? Those renewable energy resources can be used to support heavy industry, used to create things like green aluminium and green steel, and also provide the world's energy needs in a low-carbon future.
The Minister for Resources has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And we've gone from the pop gun to I'm not sure how to describe the member for McMahon. But, Mr Speaker, I'll be very frank. I'm not interested in what the New South Wales Treasurer has to say. My job is to deliver for the resources sector. It's to look after the water interests of all Australians. It's to ensure the Murray-Darling Basin continues to have the right balance. It's about making sure that our exporters have markets, and those markets, while they exist, we will fill them, Mr Speaker. While there are markets for our products, we will fill them. Those opposite look to close sections down. They want to close industry down. They want to close the resources sector down. Mr Speaker, on this side of the chamber, we will continue to support the sector.
Has the Minister concluded his answer? The Minister has concluded his answer. The member for Melbourne.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Glasgow Summit is demanding the whole world lift its 2030 climate targets before it's too late to stop runaway global warming. You boast of meeting and beating your 2030 goals, but it's easy to beat a terrible target set by Tony Abbott. The US has lifted their 2030 targets. The UK has too, with a 68% cut. Prime Minister, why won't you meet and beat the US and UK targets and do Australia's fair share, with a 75% target as determined by Australia's Independent Climate Targets Panel? Or have you given up on keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees, condemning regional Australia to extreme droughts, floods and sea level rises?
The Prime Minister has the
Mr Speaker, I don't know why the member for Melbourne wants to talk down the great achievements of Australians in rural and regional areas that has seen Australia reduce its carbon emissions since 2005 by 20%, which is more than New Zealand, it's more than the United States, it's more than Canada, Mr Speaker, it's more than many countries around the world, because when Australia reduces emissions and Australian farmers and those in rural and regional Australia do the heavy lifting, I think they should expect this place, Mr Speaker, to respect them. They should respect their efforts and they should respect their contributions. But, Mr Speaker, I think Australians are growing a little tired of the Greens, Mr Speaker, and joined officers by those opposite from time to time, Mr Speaker, in talking down rural and regional Australians and their contributions to ensuring that their environments and their communities, Mr Speaker, are stronger and their way of life is protected. Mr Speaker, the targets that I took to the last election, Mr Speaker, were endorsed by the Australian people. They rejected the targets that were put forward, Mr Speaker, by the Labor Party and the Greens. They rejected them. They endorsed our targets, and I said we would meet and beat those targets, and indeed we will, Mr Speaker. We will keep faith with the Australian people on the things that we pledged at the last election, and we will exceed their expectations on what those targets were set out at the last election. Mr Speaker, Australian people are doing the heavy lifting. Australia has the highest rate of solar on roofs of any country in the world. Last year, Mr Speaker, we had more renewable investment in this country in 1 year than Labor had in 6. Mr Speaker, our rate of growth of renewable investment is outstripping countries all around the world, and our lower emissions technology roadmap, Mr Speaker, is ensuring that hydrogen and other important fuels and opportunities are being realised all around the country. The Leader of the Greens, Mr Speaker, needs to understand it's performance that counts, not empty aspiration, Mr Speaker. And what Australia can point to is a track record of delivering, Mr Speaker, a 20% reduction in emissions at the same time as Australia's achieved a 40% increase in the size of our economy. I'd like to see another country match that, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Greens and the apologists with him in the Labor Party, Mr Speaker, should stop running Australia down. We are carrying our weight, we are making our contribution, and we won't be told by people outside of this country how we should be meeting our targets.
The member for Moncrieff.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to our Treasurer. Will the Treasurer remind the House how the Morrison government's strong economic management and its commitment to lower taxes is helping to strengthen our economy and producing more jobs for families and businesses across Australia? And is the Treasurer aware of any alternative policies?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Moncrieff for a question because she's a champion for her local community, Mr Speaker, with a background in small business, and she has supported policies that's delivered more than 70,000 taxpayers in her electorate with a tax cut, Mr Speaker. Now, on this side of the House, we stand for more jobs and lower taxes. When we came to government, unemployment was 5.7%. Today, it's 4.6%, and 1.4 million additional people are in work since we came to government. And we have legislated through the parliament more than $300 billion of income tax cuts, abolishing a whole tax bracket with 95% of taxpayers paying a marginal rate of tax of no more than 30 cents in the dollar. We've cut taxes for small business down to 25%, and we've introduced and implemented the largest immediate expensing in business investment incentives Australia has ever seen. And combined with our 10-year infrastructure pipeline, projects like Snowy 2.0, projects like the Western Sydney Airport, projects like the Melbourne-Brisbane Inland Rail have helped create jobs across the country, as well as our skills program. More than 450,000 places for job training and 170,000 apprenticeships is helping to create more jobs across the country. Now, I'm asked, are there any alternative policies? And we know that the Leader of the Opposition has come up with two. He's come up with two. There was the National Driver's Licence and there was the $6 billion conversation starter paying people who have already had the jab. And he asked us to support his policy that his own shadow finance minister will not support herself. Now, Mr Speaker, we also know that the member for Rankin, we know he likes to tax a lot. He does. And so it was no surprise that we read recently on the front page of The Australian, Greg Brown's story revealing that the member for Rankin is planning a $27 billion family business tax. Yes, that's right. 300,000 small businesses to be affected. Now, if you're a mum and dad running a cafe and you are each earning $75,000 each from that cafe, under Labor's plan, you'll pay $14,000 a year more in tax. So, Mr Speaker, this is the Labor Party way. This is their playbook. Higher taxes, more spending, and when they spend, you pay for it.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Now that the Prime Minister supports Labor's policy of net zero emissions by 2050, will he also support Labor's policy to legislate net zero emissions by 2050?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, the Coalition does not support Labor's policy because the Labor Party have a target with no plan, Mr Speaker. They have a target with no plan.
Member for Gorton.
Mr Speaker, that is not the Coalition policy. The policy of the Coalition is to have a plan with a target, so people actually know what we plan to do to achieve the target that they want to achieve. And, Mr Speaker, we have been working through carefully, considering all of the implications, Mr Speaker.
The Prime Minister
Let me go
will
for 30
resume
seconds.
his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I'd ask the Prime Minister to table his plan, if he's got one.
That's no point of order. That's no point of order. The Prime Minister has the call. Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Soon enough. Don't worry. Soon enough. Don't worry. The Australian people will know our plan, Mr. Speaker, but they won't know the Labor Party's
Members on my
plan.
left, the Leader of the Opposition.
They won't know the Labor Party's plan because despite having said they wanted to achieve net zero by 2050, Mr. Speaker, for some years now, there is still no plan for how they will achieve it. There is still no estimate of what it will cost. Mr. Speaker, Labor doesn't even have a 2030 target, let alone having a plan for how they will achieve their 2050 target, Mr. Speaker. But what the Australian people know is the same genius on the Labor side who came up, Mr. Speaker, with the retirees tax, the same genius who came up with the housing tax and the superannuation tax, Mr. Speaker, the same genius that came up with all of those economy-destroying policies is the same genius that the Leader of the Labor Party was relying on for the Labor Party to achieve a 2050 net zero outcome, Mr. Speaker. The only net zero outcome that will come from the Labor Party, Mr. Speaker, is what will happen to the Australian people and their prosperity, Mr. Speaker, because you cannot trust Labor with an economic plan to deliver on a net zero 2050 target. Mr. Speaker, our plan is clear, Mr. Speaker. Technology, not taxes. We're not going to be mandating or shutting down industries, Mr. Speaker. We're going to let people make their own choices. We're going to make sure there's a portfolio of technologies that we can bring to scale, Mr. Speaker, and bring to affordability, backed up by getting the balance right between affordable, reliable power, Mr. Speaker, and ensuring that we are achieving the lower emissions outcomes that we're seeking. And we will be absolutely transparent about that, because that is one of the things that the Australian government has delivered year in, year out on being fully transparent about our emissions reductions across the world, which shows that we are 20% down. Mr. Speaker, Labor have no plan for their target. They've signed up Australia and they even want to put it in law, and they can't even tell Australians how they'll do it or how much it'll cost. It's just a rerun of Bill 2.0.
Members on both sides. The member for McKellar has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health and Aged Care. Minister, will you please outline for the House how the vaccine rollout is providing protection for Australians and supporting the national roadmap by helping people regain their freedoms?
The Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member for McKellar. Today's a great day. Kids in New South Wales are going back to school. People are going back to work. We're seeing people regain their lives. And looking at his own electorate and his community, 95% first vaccination rate in the Northern Beaches, over 90% second vaccination in the Northern Beaches. People are being protected, and as a result of those protections, they're following the national roadmap. And as a result of that, they are regaining their freedoms and their lives and all of the things which represent the very best of Australia. And all of this is happening in a world where we've now passed over 160 million cases of COVID this year, where over 3.1 million lives have been lost this year. And so the threat is real. The challenge is clear. The danger is present. And that's why what we've been doing in Australia has been so important. We know that over the weekend, another 320,000 vaccinations. We're now at more than 34.3 million vaccinations for the nation, 86.8% first doses. These are things which are of profound importance in saving lives and protecting lives. And in terms of saving lives, what we have seen is that Australia has the third lowest rate across the OECD of the 38 nations of lives lost this year and across the entire pandemic. So our success is measured in 30,000 lives saved compared with the OECD average, 45,000 lives saved compared with the United States and the UK, which have done it so hard. And we continue to see vaccinations rise. 94% of the over 50s have had a first vaccination, 96% of the over 60s, 98% of the over 70s, the most vulnerable, have been vaccinated. And so all of these things are leading to the freedoms and the protections as different states and territories follow the roadmap. What we're seeing in New South Wales, the scenes of joy we saw in Victoria over the weekend, of families being reunited, of mums and dads being able to see their sons and their daughters, of grandparents and grandchildren coming together. These are things which are of the greatest human meaning and importance. The vaccination program is driving that. We're going to have one of the highest rates in the world, with one of the lowest death rates and one of the strongest economic recoveries. That is about saving lives and protecting lives and following the plan.
The member for McMahon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, and I refer to his previous answer in which he said he would release his climate plan soon enough. The Minister for Regionalisation has said in regard to the government's secret deal on net zero, the first rule of Fight Club is not to talk about Fight Club. Don't Australians deserve more respect than this? Apart from a pay rise for the Minister for Resources, what is Australia's climate policy, and why don't the Australian people have a right to know?
The Prime Minister has the call.
They have every right to know, Mr Speaker. And we set it out very clearly at the last election and every day since, Mr Speaker. And as a result, emissions reductions, Mr Speaker, emissions reductions have fallen by 20% on 2005 levels. I said we would meet and beat our 2030 target, Mr Speaker, and indeed we will meet and beat our 2030 target. And I'm looking forward to setting that out, Mr Speaker, at the Glasgow COP26. We will set out very clearly both our commitments in relation to 2050 as well as, Mr Speaker, our commitments in relation to 2030, which we took to the last election. At the last election, there was one issue. It was a question of 45% emissions reduction, which was put forward by the Labor Party, and 26 to 28% put forward by the Liberal Nationals parties, Mr Speaker. That's what we took to the last election. The Australian people rejected Labor's policies because Labor couldn't explain their policies. They had no plan to achieve their policies. They couldn't say what they cost. And, Mr Speaker, nothing has changed since that time. Labor still don't have a plan as to how they're going to meet their targets. They don't even have a target for 2030, Mr Speaker. I recall that when the government came to first be elected, we made very clear in 2013 that we would commit to the 2020 target. Now, that was, Mr Speaker, that was 7 years from that date. We're 8 years from 2030 and the opposition can't even make a commitment about a 2030 target. Well, not only did we make that commitment before we were elected, Mr Speaker, we met that commitment and we beat that commitment.
The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker, on relevance, the question went solely to the government's own policy and plan for net zero by 2050. It went to whether the Australian people deserve to see what that plan is. The Prime Minister's spoken about the last campaign where he opposed net zero by 2050. Opposed net zero by 2050.
We won't debate the matter.
And the Prime Minister isn't being relevant to the question.
We'll call the Prime Minister and listen carefully. I am giving a bit more tolerance given the other aspects, the nature of the question and some of the other descriptives in it, but the Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I've said very clearly that a government that I lead was not going to support a net zero by 2050 target unless we could detail a plan to achieve it. Now, Mr Speaker, those opposites scoff at this. Those opposites scoff at this, Mr Speaker. What they don't understand, Mr Speaker, is that people in rural and regional Australia and right across the country deserve that. They deserve to know what the plan is, how it impacts them and how we're going to achieve that. And, Mr Speaker, that is what we'll be setting out very, very clearly, just as we set that out for our 2030 target at the last election. The Labor Party just signed themselves up to a net zero by 2050 target without any consideration, without any plan, without any understanding of the costs, and they were just happy to let Australians pay for it. Now, that's not our approach. Mr Speaker, Australians will see very clearly our plan for how we will meet our targets, and we will be very faithful to the commitments we made at the last election, where we said what our 2030 targets would be. Those opposite couldn't explain their policies. We could. That's why Australians can trust the Liberals and the Nationals with an economic plan that enables us to meet our emissions reductions targets. They know that both parties in our coalition, which, Mr Speaker, have rightly wrestled with this issue, have rightly, Mr Speaker, considered carefully the implications and the costs and the issues that will need to be dealt with.
The member for Fisher.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry, Energy and Emissions Reduction. Will the Minister update the House on the progress of the Morrison government's technology-led approach to reducing emissions? How does this ensure that we create jobs and strengthen industry as we reduce emissions? And is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The member for McEwen will also cease interjecting. He's interjecting constantly. The Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Fisher for his question. And of course he knows, as we all do on this side of the House, that the way to reduce emissions and to deliver affordable, reliable energy is to be technology-led, Mr Speaker. And of course, as someone who worked in traditional industries like the construction industry as a builder before he came into this place, he knows how important this is for our traditional industries, Mr Speaker, and that is why we're focusing on technology, not taxes, Mr Speaker, not taxes, on reducing the cost of low emissions technologies, not increasing the cost of traditional technologies and increasing the cost of electricity, Mr Speaker. We've seen 1 in 4 houses in Australia with solar on their roofs, but we're also focused on a portfolio of technologies that delivers that affordable, reliable energy, which has been such an important part of Australia's competitive advantage, Mr Speaker, and we're positioning Australia for success. Transparently, $20 billion in our technology investment roadmap, which will bring forward $80 billion of public and private sector investment in the coming years, 160,000 jobs in the coming decade from that technology investment roadmap, Mr Speaker. This is not about imposing new costs on Australian households and businesses, Mr Speaker. It's not about raising the price of electricity or destroying jobs in traditional industries, because at the end of the day, there are only 2 ways to reduce emissions: technology or taxes, and we've picked technology, Mr Speaker. But those opposite, they choose tax every time, Mr Speaker. Now, we heard it again on the weekend. We heard it again on the weekend because the Leader of the Opposition doubled down on his approach to a technology-led focus for bringing down emissions, describing it as absurd, Mr Speaker. He described it as absurd. He described our clean energy focus as absurd, Mr Speaker. And Labor voted against a technology-led approach 7 times, Mr Speaker. They will not be happy. They will not be happy until Australians pay more tax, Mr Speaker. Now, we heard this from the Shadow Finance Minister. We heard it from him in the last week or so, that Labor is considering reintroducing an electricity tax, Mr Speaker. He said it. We are looking at everything. That's what he said, Mr Speaker. We are looking at everything.
The Minister will just pause for a second, grab a seat somewhere. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order. The member for McMahon. Leader of the Opposition.
Yes, Mr Speaker. It goes to the verbling that occurs here regularly at the dispatch box.
Members on my right.
On Saturday.
No, this is not an opportunity for a point of order. I've made this clear. I'm going to ask the Leader of the Opposition to resume his seat. And as I've said many times, I can't vouch for the facts of answers or questions. And if you think that through, it would be impractical to be otherwise. We'd be suspending the House while I went and was judge and jury. So, as the Leader of the Opposition well knows, he has an opportunity at the end of question time if he believes he's been misrepresented. The Minister has the call.
Well, they're a bit sensitive, Mr Speaker, because,
the minister
they're in
will-
favour of taxes, Mr Speaker, and we heard it from the Shadow Finance Minister. She said we're looking at everything. We're looking at everything. Now, the member for McMahon's in that club, Mr Speaker. He loves a tax. There's never been a tax he didn't like, Mr Speaker. He salivates over the opportunity of bringing forward an electricity tax, Mr Speaker, but whilst those opposite are thinking about how to raise the price of energy, we're getting on with our technology-led approach.
The member for Brand.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Given his previous statements that electric vehicles would end the weekend, renewable energy targets are nuts, and that the world's biggest battery to store renewable energy was as useful as a big banana and a big prawn, why would Australians trust the Prime Minister to deliver action on climate change?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I opposed Labor's policies, Mr Speaker. I opposed their approach to the issues you're referring to. I didn't agree with the way that they wanted to do that, Mr Speaker, and the Australian people agreed with me. They agreed with me, Mr Speaker. The approach that the Labor Party was seeking to take at the last election on those matters was not an approach that I agreed with. Mr Speaker, we had policies that were supportive of electric vehicles and renewable technologies. All of these things, Mr Speaker, at the last election, and the Australian people supported those policies. They supported those policies. And, Mr Speaker, we want to keep doing that. Because under our policies, Mr Speaker, we want to see more and more investment going into these areas. And that's why we are trying to change ARENA's mandate so they can invest in these important technologies. Now, Mr Speaker, there's $192.5 million in support for lower emissions technologies, including $72 million to support EV, electric vehicles and hydrogen vehicle charging infrastructure, more than $52 million for microgrids in regional Australia. The member for Indi, I know, will be very interested in that. Over $20 million to look at how we can make heavy trucks more fuel efficient and adopt new technologies, and $47 million to help heavy industry to reduce their energy consumption. Now, Mr Speaker, that's what we're trying to do. The Labor Party are voting against all of those things by opposing and supporting the disallowance motion that would prevent us from investing, Mr Speaker, in those renewable technologies, in particular on electric vehicles and hydrogen vehicle charging infrastructure. So, Mr Speaker, I'm not going to cop the hypocrisy of the Labor Party, whose policies were rejected at the last election because they were carried away with a fantasy, Mr Speaker. They overreached, and the Australian people called them out and said, we're not going to pay for your policies that you haven't thought through. That's what they're not going to pay for, Mr Speaker, and the Labor Party is still in the same place. They still have not thought their policies through. They still have not prepared a plan for how they're going to achieve their targets. They don't even have a 2030 target, Mr Speaker, and they're going to the Australian people and say, just trust us. Who would trust the Labor Party with an economic policy to take Australia through one of the biggest changes in the global economy, which is occurring with energy, than we've seen probably in at least a generation, if not 50 years? The Labor Party cannot be trusted to manage the economy through this major change. Our policies, Mr Speaker, will set out very clear plans. There will be technology, there won't be taxes, Mr Speaker. There will be clear respect for people's choices. We won't be mandating what they should buy, when they should buy it and where they should buy it, Mr Speaker. We are going to let Australians make their own mind up because we trust Australians to make good choices in their interest, and they'll have lower taxes to pay for them too, courtesy of the Treasurer, Mr Speaker. You cannot trust Labor on their emissions policies.
Has concluded. And I call the member for Nichols.
Thank you very much, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Agriculture and Northern Australia. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison-Joyce government has supported regional Australia through droughts, bushfires and now the COVID-19 pandemic, and ensured that the agricultural industry has had the support it requires to prosper and remain a pillar of the economy?
The Minister for Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Nichols for his question. Acknowledge the rich and proud history of the agricultural sector that Nichols plays in helping us reach our $100 billion goal, and he knows better than anyone over the last couple of years. We not only had to face up to COVID-19 and the constraints that's put on the agricultural sector, but we've also had to face up to fires and drought. In fact, some parts of the country are still in drought, and the Australian taxpayer, on behalf of the Australian government has invested over $11 billion into drought programs, $2.8 billion towards bushfire recovery, of which $2.4 billion of that has gone out the door. The last piece is around making sure the long-term economic reconstruction of these communities take place. But the commitment around drought funding has been significant in making sure that we build the resilience into Australian agriculture well beyond and making sure that they reach our goal of $100 billion by 2030. And to that end, we created the National Drought Strategy, 3 simple pillars. Firstly, about the here and now, making sure that our farmers have the dignity and respect when times got tough. A social security payment that let them to put bread and butter on the table, to be able to have the dignity to take the kids in to sport on a Saturday, to make sure that they could do the things that they normally do. It was through the Regional Investment Corporation, $4 billion worth of loans that have gone out, concessional loans, to support farmers, not just to restock and replant, but in fact, in the height of the drought, they're able to refinance up to $2 million of their debt from a commercial bank to the Regional Investment Corporation and pay 0 interest and 0 repayments. That actually put hundreds of thousands of dollars out of the big banks' pockets and into farmers' pockets. That was about stimulating the community. And our second pillar is about stimulating the community. Over $500 million worth of infrastructure projects in making sure that those economies kept going. Because you've got to understand, once the drought hits, the drought extends past the farm gate into those communities that support them, because when the farmers don't have the money, there is no money going through those communities. And this was about diversifying their economic base, making sure that we're investing in tourism and bringing people out there, bringing new money to their economy, thinking long term. And we are the first government to think about the future. We create a future drought fund, a $5 billion fund that those opposite actually voted against, in one of the most disgraceful acts in our nation's history. In the middle of a drought, they voted against a $5 billion drought fund that gives a $100 million investment every year. This was meant to be about supporting an agricultural industry that now makes over $70 billion. But those opposite wanted to turn their back in the most time of need that Australian farmers have. And in fact, there is no alternative to that, Mr. Speaker, because in the last budget speech, those opposite could not even use the word agriculture once. So regional rural Australia depends on the coalition to ensure that it has a future well beyond now.
The has concluded. The member for Corangamite.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. I refer to his comments in this House last week concerning net zero. Did the Deputy Prime Minister yesterday oppose a policy of net zero emissions by 2050?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for a question, and right from the start say I 100% support our process of going to Glasgow.
Members on my left.
For the target of net zero emissions. I do that, Mr. Speaker, because I clearly laid out the process of how the National Party would deliberate over this. I clearly laid out a process, Mr. Speaker, that was never given to other people in the regional members of the Labor Party. And that process, of course, was that our position would not be determined by the executive. It would not be determined by one person. It would be determined by the views of the party members, and yesterday they did precisely that. The position is settled, and we are going forward as a coalition government to make sure that we do the very best. But, Mr. Speaker, it's really important that we got to that position. I'll tell you why. Because there is a difference in policies. We believe in technology, they believe in legislation. They believe in laws, we believe in technology. They believe in legislation because legislation outlaws
Member
things.
for Barton.
Legislation outlaws things. And they are going to be the greatest outlaws since Billy the Kid. They're going to outlaw Central Queensland. They're going to outlaw the Hunter Valley. They're going to outlaw the coal industry. They're going to outlaw the miners because they have said that they are coming forward with legislation. That is your policy. That is your policy. Are you saying you're not going to legislate it? Did you say? Are you?
No, just say the Deputy Prime Minister.
Are you going to legislate it?
No, the Deputy Prime Minister. No, the Deputy Prime Minister.
He's mute.
No, you're not. Well, you are, but you're not. And I'm just going to caution the Deputy Prime Minister. We've done this We've done this a few times. Ministers are not going to... No, you haven't got your microphone on, so you just need to wait. The Deputy Prime Minister will not ask questions. He will just simply bring himself to the question that was asked that he's already straying from. The Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, so for the sake of the House, for the sake of the honourable member opposite, the issue is resolved.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I seek leave to be able to answer the question asked by the Deputy Prime Minister.
You can't seek leave to answer a question. You can seek leave in a formal motion.
I can, actually, Mr. Speaker. Under the standing orders, I can seek leave to make a statement to the House.
That's better.
To answer the question posed by the Deputy Prime Minister on whether we support legislating net zero emissions by 2050.
Is leave granted? The Leader of the House.
Mr. Speaker, for the sake of all of us here, no.
Leave is not granted. The member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Education and Youth. With students in my electorate back in the classroom from today, why is it important for the national curriculum to lift learning standards and teach kids the origins of our strong liberal democracy? What has been the response to your calls for a greater emphasis on this?
The Minister for Education.
Well, can I thank the member for Lindsay for her question, for her incredible advocacy of Western Sydney. And she, like so many other parents in New South Wales, are so pleased that kids are back at school in New South Wales today, and in just another week or so, every single child across the country will be back doing face-to-face schooling. And when they're back, we're backing them with record school funding, with additional mental health support, and ensuring that there's fantastic opportunities for them for when they leave school. But we're also, Mr. Speaker, fighting for a national curriculum that lifts learning standards and teaches our kids a balanced and positive view of Australia and the origins of its liberal democracy, because if they don't learn about our liberal democracy, then they'll be less willing to protect it and contribute to it. And, Mr. Speaker, plenty of people have backed this position over the last few days. Respected history professor Greg Malish, for example, says that, and I quote, "We need an education system that provides both intellectual rigour and respect for our traditions. It is the foundations of a civilised social order." Geoffrey Blaney is arguably our greatest living historian, says in support as well, he says, "In my view, the condemnation of our country has gone too far." He says Australia is one of the world's conspicuous success stories in modern times, and that's why so many people have come here, is what he said. Christian Schools Australia, they said, "We need a curriculum of hope, not despair, a curriculum that points to a positive view of our nation, not a negative one." And Peter Jennings, Mr. Speaker, who, as you might know, is the Executive Director of our leading national security think tank, ASPI, says that if we don't defend our democratic values in schools, then they'll be attacked from outside. And he says, and I quote, "Australia has been a remarkably successful democracy, and that's something that we should teach our kids to be proud about." Now, Mr. Speaker, I apologise. That was a trigger word for those opposite, being proud of our country. I should have given them warning in relation to that particular word, but because we know that they have a different view of our country, because when they were asked, and the member for Watson was their spokesperson, when they were asked, what do you think about having a curriculum which has a positive view of our country, he said that, well, that's a little bit weird. That was their response. That's the Labor Party's response, that it's a bit weird to have a positive view of our country, that it's a bit weird to have high values, that it's a bit weird to learn the origins of our liberal democracy.
Members on my right will cease interjecting. The Minister will cease interjecting. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
On the standing order requiring members to be referred to by their title, I don't know who he's talking about. I've only said his rants were weird. That's what I've referred to. So I don't know who he's talking about, but it's not the member for Watson.
His seat. The Minister has the call for
Mr. Speaker, parents
13
don't
seconds.
think it's weird to have a positive, optimistic view about Australia in our national curriculum. We're the greatest country in the world. We're the wealthiest, most liberal, the most egalitarian, the most tolerant country that's probably ever existed, and that's much to be proud of.
Concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Now the government has signed up to Labor's policy for net zero emissions by 2050, will it also sign up to Labor's policy to fix electricity transmission and rewire the nation, which will rebuild and modernise the grid and cut energy prices?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll ask the Minister for Industry, Energy and Emissions Reduction to speak to the government's transmission policies, Mr. Speaker, which have been set out now in successive budgets. And I say again, Mr. Speaker, we have no intention of signing up to Labor's policy when it comes to their approach to net zero emissions, because they have no plan. You cannot have a target for 2050 net zero emissions when you don't have a plan to achieve it, Mr. Speaker. That is not a policy, Mr. Speaker. That is just empty rhetoric from the Labor Party looking for cheers from the hard left, Mr. Speaker. That's all it is. It's not a policy.
The Prime
They
Minister
don't have
will
a
resume
policy.
his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. The question went specifically to Labor's plan to rewire the nation, which I announced in my first budget reply, a $20 billion plan to fix energy transmission in this country.
I
It went to that, and whether the Prime Minister will support it.
I would
It is
normally...
precisely.
No, I'm going to actually rule on it. We're not going to have a three-way debate. Normally I would be saying to the Prime Minister he wasn't asked about alternatives, but the first line of the question wasn't what your point of order was. The first line opened the question up because it stated now that the government has signed up to Labor's policies for net zero. So in that sense you asked about your own broad policies, and well you did. I mean, I didn't ask the question, and because of that the Prime Minister has greater tolerance. With that preamble there, I'll just say again, if you can have a preamble in the question, don't expect that the specific part at the end will be the only part referred to. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr. Speaker, I mean, Labor's policies are about taxes. Mr. Speaker, Labor's policies aren't technology, not taxes. Labor's policies are about mandating people, Mr. Speaker, not respecting their choices. Labor's policies aren't about getting the balance right between affordable energy, Mr. Speaker, and reliable energy and ensuring lower emissions, Mr. Speaker. Labor's policies are just a blank cheque to cut emissions and making Australians pay for it, Mr. Speaker. That's what Labor's policies are. We don't support their approach. We support an approach which is very different, Mr. Speaker, that is technology, not taxes, that ensures, Mr. Speaker, that people's choices are respected and that we do get the balance right and that we can consider carefully the impact of these things on rural and regional Australia. And that's what we've been doing. Now, those opposite seek to mock that, Mr. Speaker. They seek to mock the very serious process the Liberal and Nationals have been going through to ensure that we can look people in rural and regional Australia in the eye and tell them we're doing everything both to protect their job and secure their jobs for the future. You cannot rely in rural and regional Australia on the Labor Party to protect your job when it comes to addressing climate change, Mr. Speaker. You cannot trust them to do that because they signed up to net zero by 2050 without a plan, without a cost, without a 2030 target, without anything, Mr. Speaker. They are a vacuum when it comes to what it will cost to determine what their commitments that they want to put in law, Mr. Speaker, and what they will do, they'll outlaw the prosperity of rural and regional Australia. But I'll leave the remaining 40 seconds to the Minister.
The Minister has the call for
Well,
about
thank you, Mr.
38
Speaker. But look, transmission projects are a critical part of ensuring we maintain a reliable, affordable grid, and we're committed to them, Mr. Speaker. That's why we're supporting every major transmission project in the national electricity grid, whether it's Marridus Link, I know the Tasmanians here strongly support that, whether it's PEC from South Australia, Mr. Speaker, HumeLink, VNI West. These are our focus, Mr. Speaker. We've got the multi-billion-dollar balance sheet of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation supporting it, and that's why, Mr. Speaker, we're seeing electricity prices coming down as we've reduced our emissions by over 20% since 2005.
The member for Stirling.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence. Will the Minister inform the House how the Morrison government's investment in defence capability will provide the Australian Defence Force with the capability edge that it needs to protect Australians in a changing geostrategic environment? And is the Minister aware of any alternative policy approaches?
The Minister for Defence has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question, and I thank him for his service to our country as a member of the Australian Defence Force, and for his enduring interest in making sure that our country, that our government does everything we can to help our Defence Force personnel. I enjoyed a phone hookup with him only last week, and clearly he still has that passion for members of the Australian Defence Force, and, Mr Speaker, I hope he still has that passion for this parliament for many years to come. Mr Speaker, the Indo-Pacific, as we know, continues to become more and more complex and less stable every day. We know that the world is changing and that we cannot take our position in the Indo-Pacific for granted. We need to make sure that we have a significant investment into the security of our country and to provide support to our neighbours, Mr Speaker, incredibly important. That's why the security partnership of AUKUS was struck, because we want to make sure that we can invest, that we can work even more closely with our allies in the United States and the United Kingdom, and with our Five Eyes partners, those two including Canada and New Zealand. Mr Speaker, we have put our money where our mouth is because we've increased defending and we've committed spending in the defence portfolio now to 2% of GDP, and will go further. We're investing $65 billion, Mr Speaker, over the course of the next decade into next-generation air capabilities, including through acquiring long-range anti-ship missiles. Our naval shipbuilding plan, including the construction of at least 8 nuclear-powered submarines, represents the largest regeneration of the Navy since the Second World War. Mr Speaker, if you contrast that track record to the Labor Party, when the Labor Party was last in government, Mr Speaker, they cut spending, get this, they cut spending to the lowest level since 1938, Mr Speaker, to 1.56% of GDP, and they still to this very day stand condemned for doing that, Mr Speaker, because when Labor was last in government, they jacked up taxes, Mr Speaker, on every Australian, and at the last election they promised to increase taxes for superannuants, for low-income earners, for middle-income earners, for householders, for home owners, for those that were looking to go into retirement, and at the same time, Mr Speaker, they cut their investment in defence. It was a terrible period in our country's history, Mr Speaker. Don't forget it was at a time when they lost control of our borders, Mr Speaker. Why would they cut spending in defence? Because they needed to plug the holes and the gaps in the blowout in spending elsewhere. Mr Speaker, Labor is known for two things: for higher taxes, Mr Speaker, and cutting funding to defence.
The member for Ballarat.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Can the Deputy Prime Minister confirm that between 2016 and 2021, 90% of the $1.1 billion doled out through the Building Better Regions Fund went to government-held and targeted electorates? Is the government looking after the regions, or is it actually looking after itself?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for a question and remind the honourable member that the Coalition represents over 5 million square kilometres of this nation. 5 million square kilometres. The Labor Party represents approximately 1.5 million square kilometres, and 1.35 million of that 1.5 is one seat, Lingiari, which we are going to make sure that we look after as well. We're going to look after them as well. And the reason we have the Building Better Regions Fund is we reach into the towns of Lingiari, of Tennant Creek, of Alice Springs to make sure that they get a fair deal. It's peculiar, Mr Speaker, whilst they are complaining about the Building Better Regions funds and us looking after regional seats, that in the same fortnight that they complain about it, close to $500 million has been allocated by the New South Wales government to an art gallery in the member for Sydney seat. Now, this is just to show you the disparity. So we will not step away from the fact that we look after the regional towns. We will not step away from the fact that we look after Gladstone or Emerald or Billawheeler or Tennant Creek, or that we will do everything in our power to make sure we look after the process of getting better roads to St Teresa in the seat of Lingiari. Mr Speaker, I also remind the House that in the most recent round, the Labor Party, which represents about 17%, got about 16% of the funds. It's hardly a disparity. It's hardly a disparity. And I also recognise that we recognise such things as the letters of recommendation and support for the Building Better Regions Fund, from the member from Lingiari to the projects in Solomon. We can see that. We have built things that take people's lives ahead. So, Mr Speaker, I say to the honourable member, we will continue on representing regional people. We will continue on with the Building Better Region Fund, and the biggest threat to the Building Better Regions funds is the outlaws on the other side.
No, just say to the Deputy Prime Minister, just that term, although it's old, has connotations. I'm just going to ask you to refrain from the member for Curtin.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is creating a stronger and safer Australia and protecting our way of life by enhancing national security? And is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Thank you, and I thank the member for her question, and I also thank her for the very important contribution that she continues to make as a member of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. National security has long been a hallmark of the coalition government. It's all about protecting Australia's sovereignty, protecting our businesses, protecting our families, and of course protecting our way of life. And that's why our government has delivered record funding to our national security agencies. But just as importantly, we're ensuring that they have the legislative backing that they need to make real gains in the fight on organised crime, on terrorism, on countering foreign interference and on improving community safety. Now, we all saw the enormous success of the AFP's Operation Ironside, which took down a significant cross-section of the Australian criminal underworld. Now, more than 300 offenders were charged and over 5,000 kilograms of drugs were seized. Now, whilst those numbers are great, what's most important is the fact that the real impact of Operation Ironside was that criminals were taken off the street, drugs were seized, meaning that lives were saved and our communities were a much safer place for Australians to live in. And of course, Operation Ironside was made possible because of the legislation that was introduced by this government in 2018. Now, this government, the Morrison government, has been building further on the capability of our national security agencies. And in the last few months alone, we've ensured that they have the ability to further tighten security at our ports and our seaports, to make sure that they are able to tackle the insidious criminal activity taking place on the dark web, and to better detect and counter foreign interference. And we've fast-tracked the legislation that we need to protect our vital infrastructure from cyber threats and ensure a stronger regime for the management of high-risk terrorist offenders. And we're taking these actions to make sure that we are in the best possible position to make sure that Australians are safe and that our communities are protected. One of the other important things that we have made sure that we do is cancel the visas of those who commit serious crimes in this country. And in fact, under the coalition government, nearly 10,000 non-citizens have had their visas cancelled or refused on character grounds. We believe that an Australian visa is a privilege. It's a privilege that you forfeit when you commit a serious crime. This government takes national security very seriously. We are committed to making sure that we do all that we can to ensure the safety of all Australians.
The member for Barton.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why did the Prime Minister fail to make every effort to properly consult Australian of the Year Grace Tame on his national strategy to prevent child sexual abuse?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm going to ask the Special Minister of State to respond to this question, because there has been a misunderstanding of this issue, Mr Speaker, that he has responsibility as Special Minister of State in terms of the Child Protection Office, Mr Speaker, to address that matter which has been raised by the member.
The Special Minister of State has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The National Strategy Development has been made possible through the incredible work and insights of those who have contributed to it. Consultations have been made with victim survivors of child sexual abuse, their advocates, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, people with disabilities, and the Australian Children's Commissioners. In relation to the Australian of the Year, in March, the head of the National Office of Child Safety had an informal introductory meeting with Ms Tame in Canberra to discuss the national strategy. In March, the head of the National Office of Child Safety emailed Ms Tame about how she might work with the National Office of Child Safety in relation to the strategy. On the 13th of May, I spoke to Ms Tame to talk to her about the measures in the budget that form part of the national strategy. In May, further, the National Office of Child Safety emailed Ms Tame to advise her of the national strategy commitments. It was to anticipate further activity of Ms Tame, including her advocacy on these issues. In May, further, the Healing Foundation, on behalf of the National Office of Child Safety, emailed Ms Tame to invite her to attend a consultation workshop on the 10th of June on these issues for victim survivors. A follow-up email was sent. On the 14th of June, I personally travelled to Tasmania with the head of the National Office of Child Safety to meet with Ms Tame. The position and the role that I take as the Minister responsible for the National Office of Child Safety and the work that I've done in relation to the national strategy was one that has been informed by Ms Tame's meeting with me and her engagement with our officials. I thank her for the insight onto those issues, but also the fact that I had concerns and reservations about some of the elements of the strategy, and Grace and I spoke about those, and she actually assisted me in understanding the importance of them. That will be announced this week. On the 20th of October, Mr Speaker, the National Office of Child Safety emailed Ms Tame to make sure that she participates and invite her to the launch later this week. As a result of media discussions on this issue, there has been further interaction with Ms Tame to ensure that she can participate with other victim survivors in relation to the national strategy launch. Subsequently, in relation to tweets from the Leader of the Opposition, on Friday afternoon I reached out to his Chief of Staff to inform him of some of these engagements with the Australian of the Year. In relation to the national strategy, Mr Speaker, it is an important issue and victim survivors deserve it to be above politics.
Member for Sturt has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Immigration, Citizenship, Migrant Services and Multicultural Affairs. Will the Minister update the House on the Morrison government's legislation to protect Australians from foreign criminals? And is the Minister aware of any contrary approaches?
The Minister for Immigration has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. I want to thank the member for Sturt for his commitment to community safety. One of the main reasons we find that people want to come to Australia is because of our great reputation for being a safe and fair society. But community safety is absolutely a priority of people who've been here a long time and people who've come to our country as well, and I thank the member for Sturt for this question. The government has put forward for 3 years now legislation to increase the government's ability to protect Australians and community safety from serious criminals in so many categories that I've outlined to the House before. I do want to update the House that this bill will come back here and we will continue to pursue this legislation every day and every week until we're able to do this and secure better laws to protect Australians from serious criminals who don't come from Australia and stop people from ever coming here in the first place who pose a great risk to Australians. These are straightforward laws, they're serious crimes that we're talking about, and the bill is well constructed, and the Labor Party knows that. In terms of contrary approaches, though, we have seen from the Australian Greens a particularly contrary approach in recent weeks. In fact, they seem to hate the bill and everything it represents. Senator Marine Faruqi says the bill is damaging and toxic, and glad that the bill didn't pass. That's laws to protect Australians. Nick McKim says we're stigmatising and persecuting people. In a sense, he's got that right, Mr Speaker, people who are perpetrating crimes against Australians. The government does take that view. In other ways, we heard the Greens say that this is early onset fascism, putting forward laws to protect Australians from people who will do serious violent and sexual offences. And in the Senate, of course, we've seen Labor vote with the Greens on this, and in the House we've seen it as well. And that's why it was interesting to see an article last week that was entitled by AAP, Greens Target Balance of Power Under Labor. Now, of course, Mr Speaker, we've seen this movie before. This isn't a Hollywood blockbuster that we're watching again. It's like watching all 10 seasons of Friends again, you know, Mr Speaker. And in this article, the member for Melbourne was asked, in terms of contrary approaches...
The Minister just resumed his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
On direct relevance, what he's referring to now doesn't even reach alternative policies. He's reading different newspaper articles that he'd like to have a conversation about. I don't see how this comes to the question at all.
Call the Minister. I'd ask him to be relevant to the question.
Mr Speaker, I'm speaking about the contrary approaches that I was asked about. The contrary approach is the Labor Party, the Leader of the Opposition, supporting the member for Melbourne in terms of his opposition to these laws to deport foreign criminals from Australia. That's what I'm talking about. And in this article, the member for Melbourne was asked what sort of Prime Minister the Leader of the Opposition would make. And the member for Melbourne said, quote, "A better one if the Greens are there to push him, Mr Speaker," quote unquote. I say to the Labor Party, you are better than this. Don't support the Greens on these laws. Drop your opposition to them and join the majority of Australians in supporting the government on more powers to protect Australians from foreign criminals and people who do the wrong thing. And if you want to stand there and do that right now and intimidate me, I say to you, drop your opposition to this bill and support our laws.
The Minister's time has concluded. Members on both sides, the member for Lalor, the Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker, I seek leave to move the following motion. That the House of Representatives supports a legislated target of net zero emissions by 2050.
Is leave granted?
Leave's not granted.
Granted. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I move that so much as standing orders be suspended as would prevent the Leader of the Opposition moving the following motion immediately. That the House of Representatives supports a legislated target of net zero emissions by 2050. Mr Speaker, we've seen the only beneficiary of the change of policy be the Minister for Resources. It's always about them.
The Leader of the House has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I move the member be no longer heard.
Excuse me. The question is the Leader of the Opposition be no further heard. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 4 minutes. Okay.
Hey, Tudgy, is this bit going to be in the curriculum? How to gag Parliament. Is that in the curriculum too? Freedom of speech. He's trying to close down quiet days and we won't have a debate in Parliament. Love and no freedom of speech.
Lock the doors. The question is the Leader of the Opposition be no further heard. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left. I appoint the honourable members for Nichols and Gray. Tellers for the ayes and the honourable members for Werriwa and Lawler. Tellers for the noes. Order. The result of the division is ayes 55, noes 53. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. Is the motion seconded? The member for McMahon.
This pay rise is a bottomless pit, and that's the only policy they've got.
The member for McMahon will resume his seat. The Leader of the House has the call.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I move the member be no longer heard.
The question is the member for McMahon be no further heard. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute.
I didn't hear what it was, so I really can't tell.
Lock the doors. I appoint the same tellers as the previous division. Members must remain in their seats during this successive division unless they're changing their vote or they're leaving the chamber, in which case they must report to the tellers. Order. The result of the division is ayes 55, noes 53. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. The question now is that the motion moved by the Leader of the Opposition be disagreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute. Lock the doors. I appoint the same tellers as the previous division. Members must remain in their seats unless they're changing their vote or did not vote in the last division. Order. The result of the division is ayes 55, noes 53. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. And I give the call to the member for Wentworth.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for the Environment. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is taking a world-leading position in protecting and preserving our oceans and waterways?
The Minister for the Environment.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Wentworth for his question and commend him on his leadership in his electorate during the COVID-19 pandemic. As an island nation, our oceans are the highest priority for all Australians. We care about too much plastic in our oceans, about healthy fish stocks, about our marine ecosystems and an ocean environment that supports tourism and communities. Australia's ocean economy in fact supports nearly 340,000 full-time jobs and contributes more than $80 billion to the national economy each year. As part of the 21-22 budget, the Morrison government has announced a $100 million investment to continue leading the world and our region in managing our ocean and coastal environments and contributing to the global task of reducing emissions. This includes $39 million to reinforce Australia's position as a world leader in marine park management. Another round of the Marine Parks program in fact opened today. $11 million to incorporate sea country in Indigenous protected areas, $30 million to conserve, restore and account for blue carbon ecosystems and share that expertise with the Pacific and our international partnerships, and $18 million to protect iconic marine species like sea turtles and seabirds such as the eastern curlew. This builds on the Morrison government's $67 million investment in last year's budget that prioritised measures like tackling the impacts, Mr Speaker, of ghost nets. In this space, we recently successfully trialled a device that has allowed 2 foreign fishing nets. Now, these weigh 4 tonnes and are several kilometres long, to be safely retrieved from the waters of the Torres Strait so they don't harm our marine species. Fish, turtles, dolphins and seabirds get tangled up in these walls of death. Internationally, Australia is a member of the High-Level Panel for a Sustainable Ocean Economy, and we're a member of the Global Ocean Alliance. We support a global target to protect 30% of the ocean by 2030. In fact, we're already at 37%, and with the consultations that the Assistant Minister for Territories and I are having around the Indian Ocean territories, that may well soon be 45% of our oceans. All of this builds on the strong track record of coalition governments in protecting the ocean, from John Howard, who created the world's first oceans policy, through to the Morrison government's unprecedented $2.2 billion investment on the Great Barrier Reef. It is the coalition that has consistently worked towards the health of our oceans and the well-being of our coastal communities.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
The Leader of the House. We'll just do papers first. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Documents are tabled in accordance with the list circulated to honourable members earlier today. Full details of the documents will be recorded in the votes and proceedings.